Okay, welcome back from lunch. Hopefully everybody had an enjoyable lunch. We have our first panel after lunch, and it's creating a sustainable ROI through the right management of IP portfolios and the role of IP in commercialization. Our panel chair is John Calvert, Managing Director of Clairview IP, and I'll hand over to him to introduce his panel.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always good to have the session straight after lunch, so this is where I'm meant to ask you all to stand up and energise yourselves. We'll try and keep it interesting, keep everyone awake. I'm not going to do detailed introductions of the panel, and that's partly because we've only just assembled it today. We've got Claire standing in for Matthias, who we met this morning, and Claire has a background in economics, which means there's actually one person on the panel qualified to talk about valuation of IP and the kind of returns. Anne Akalia is working for IDEX, and she's the only person on the panel that's actually brought something tangible to show us. Andrew and I have known each other for a number of years. Still don't know quite what he does, but I'm sure he can explain to us. And then Zev, I think we met last year, and Zev is into revolutionising the patent business. So please, let's work our way along the panel, maybe Zev in reverse order, and explain our backgrounds, and I'll lead us through the discussion.
Sure. I used to be a trademark attorney in private practice for 10 years or so. Moved to the crazy idea of trying to build a company that's in the data space. So we build the underlying principle is that companies and attorneys as well should have data available when they're trying to manage an IP portfolio. We focus on pricing data because that's the most important data or the easiest win that we can provide. But kind of the ambition is all sorts of data, and I may get into the details a bit later.
My name is Andrew Sant. First thing you should know about me is I'm not a lawyer. I'm a physicist. I ran one of the tech development companies over in Cambridge for some time, and discovered actually there's more money to be made from IP than actually making stuff. One of my clients, a US corporation, then made me an offer I couldn't refuse to go and run their IP division. I did that gig for a few years, and then big companies, wheels turning strangely as they do, found myself then on the outside of every goldfish bowl on the planet, keen to knock on the door and let me in to do some good stuff with IP, but then found that most corporations don't actually know what IP really means, what it is, or let alone how to use it. And that's a space I find myself in now. And nothing really has changed in that time. That's me.
Is that a way of saying you're a consultant?
Well, to be fair, I'm here in the capacity of representing an organisation that actually has made a good fist of monetizing IP for companies big and small. So there are mechanisms out there for those with the expertise to tap into them. And the prospect of someone else actually paying for your IP portfolio is a very real and tangible thing. There are ways of doing it, and ways of doing it very well and successfully. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, then come and find me later.
Claire?
Yeah, so hi, Claire Danielson from Copenhagen Economics. I am based in our Stockholm office where our IP valuation and transfer pricing group sits. I'm an American. Before I came over here to Copenhagen Economics, I worked mostly in damages disputes out of the US, but we support clients with valuation questions for strategic purposes, for licensing, for disputes across industries. So, thanks.
Go ahead, Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne McAleer. I'm a Director of Intellectual Property at IDEX. As John said, we make things. It's not big enough to see, but IDEX make fingerprint sensors. And in the bottom corner of this card is a fingerprint sensor. And at the moment, we're working with bank card companies to integrate fingerprint sensors into bank cards. So I'm neither a lawyer or a consultant. I'm an engineer, just looking after all of the IP of the company. IDEX in total has a total of about 300 patents and applications. in total. So before I went to IDEX, I used to work for Cambridge Silicon Radio, who were a British semiconductor company working in Bluetooth. And we had more than 2,000 patents and applications, and we were bought by Qualcomm. So I was in Qualcomm for about 6 months before, I think it sounds a bit like Andrew's situation, where I decided that a big corporation wasn't for me and joined IDEX. So IDEX is a small to medium-sized enterprise, which I think is the theme of today. We're about 120 people in the UK and America. Yeah, so I'm pleased to be here today. Thank you.
And to complete the set, so John Calvert, I'm an engineer, and I worked for a company called Zyrotex once that got too big, and I wanted to go and work for a smaller company, so I started one to provide IP strategy and transaction advisory to small tech companies and large corporates. And we're now, I guess, 11 or 12 years old, 20 people, about to become 22 or 3, and working for some very big names, some of whom are in the room, but also lots of tech startups, so we'll probably bring a bit of that perspective. But the conversation here is about ROI. So we had a little discussion beforehand, and we thought it would be worth figuring out, first of all, well, what is ROI in the context of IP, and how do you measure it, and actually who cares? And that means probably with an organisation. So I don't know whether maybe Anne, in working for a real company, you could give your perspective on that to start with, in terms of how ROI might be measured.
In terms of how to, well, first of all, what is the return? It's difficult. In the previous discussion before lunch, the panel who were talking about licensing, that's an obvious way to make a return on your investment in patents, is to somehow achieve licensing fees. But for small to medium-sized enterprises, that can be a difficult thing to do. And this morning, the gentleman from GovGrant, I think, was talking as well about how do you get a tangible return immediately. If you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, he was saying that you're in a hurry and you really want to see a return on your investment now. And I think those things are really very difficult to achieve. He mentioned patent box, and that certainly is something that you could consider, but you need to be paying corporation tax to be able to benefit from patent box. So I think the answer is if you really want an immediate return, it's difficult to see how you're going to achieve that from patents. Patents is a long game, and I think if you're and it depends on your industry, but certainly IDEX, as I say, makes fingerprint sensors. It's effectively, we're a fabless semiconductor company, and in our industry, you just can't not patent. You've got to be patenting to be credible. So the returns from us as a small company in that area come from reducing litigation or reducing the impact of litigation, possibly being able to get cross licenses and settlements with companies if you were going into litigation, covenants not to sue, that type of thing. It's about the company value. The gentleman from GovGrant talked about how you're perceived as a company if somebody's looking through the shop window. So it's those kind of returns that we really would be trying to see.
Maybe a question to Claire following on from that, in terms of the if you spend a lot of your life modelling damages models and various things, I suppose that's pretty much patent centric. But how do those models work in terms of working out a return on investment?
Yeah, so it's not always patent-centric. One, it can also be trademark. It can be brand-related. It can be trade secrets as well. But I think the way that we think about it is from two perspectives. One, you can think about it in terms of, are you saving some cost? Are you minimizing costs? Or are you generating revenue in some way? So is there an additional price that you can command because you have some IP asset? But also in terms of minimizing costs, that can be separate from disputes on the defensive side, right? Can you avoid getting into litigation by having patents, ensuring your freedom to operate? And again, I think, as Anne mentioned, it can very much depend on your industry what that looks like. And so that's a question that I think we've seen a lot recently in, for example, foods, where it may have been traditionally trade secret based. There are more companies who are now thinking about patents as a way to protect their space because they're seeing other companies that they compete with coming up and saying, well, we have a patent in this area. And so also I think this, what is a return, can evolve with the industry, and this is what we're starting to see now.
Andrew, I guess in your background in Crown, would that be something that was measured in terms of return on investment on IP?
Yeah, the question was asked many times. I mean, the annual budget for IP within Crown, so this is not Crown paints, this is Crown as in metal packaging, what used to be a metal box in days gone by. It was a huge IP budget, but spread over about 250 plus different projects. So when you slice and dice that budget that way, each project becomes actually quite cost sensitive. So it wasn't just a given that here's an innovation, we're just going to go out and patent or protect or design or whatever to cover this innovation. You had to think quite carefully, strategically about what we decide, how we decided to invest the IP budget for this particular project, where we sought protection, where are our competitors, where are our markets, distribution routes, etc. Where are the sweet spots in that network? Because no one, even big organizations, can't afford to patent the world. But oftentimes there's conversations around what's the return and actually what's being invested. The return comes back in many ways, but one way I sort of address that is to flip that question on its head. And I mean, this space is full of acronyms, as most areas are, and I'd throw one into my own. Well, what about the pony? I'd usually get a blank face and, what the hell do you mean? Pony, P-O-N-I, what's the price of not investing? Yeah, think about that. So I'll think about reasons to invest, and you go in and think about the consequences of losing this business completely, or at least having our market share rapidly diluted. But the interesting thing about return, though, is not really just, I'm going to create this monopolistic space and dominate exclusively and all that side of things, which is the usual power and rights associated with IP. But increasingly, for companies to have a more broader perspective of what IP is and view it actually as an instrument for cooperation and collaboration, not an instrument for mutual annihilation. So this is a ticket by which two parties come together. And unless you actually hold that ticket, there's no reason for the other party to even be interested in you, to have that conversation. So a lot of the return actually comes through, I think it was Marshall Phelps who, in one of his books, mentioned the phrases of, I think it was useful consequences and valuable results. So you've got a portfolio of patents, and Crown, where they had 200 plus families and thousands of patents worldwide. Of those patents, which ones are actually earning a dime? Very, very few. Very few. But the ones that were blockbusters and more than paid for the rest. But it was a brave person to decide, any given point in time, which one of these patent families do I cull? And I've got some anecdotal stories about do's and don'ts of that. Maybe it'll come out later in the talk. But in terms of return, it's a far broader church than just income. There's opportunities abound, and using IP as a bridge for companies to come together and to do business is far more valuable than just looking at, I'm going to dominate this market and milk it for what it's worth.
Thank you. Zev, any views on that?
Yeah, and there's obviously a measurement problem, and we all know that. It's IP is beautiful in the sense that it's so speculative. Are we even going to have a right at the end of this journey? And it starts from this, and it goes on. What is this right worth? And we talk to a lot of IP owners, and this keeps coming up. So in many ways, there's lots of things that we don't know how to measure, and we will not know how to measure. Some things we can measure, and I think that looking at it from a practical perspective, what we tend to, it's nice to have the philosophical debate on the big things, but the things that we can measure, we should. And kind of two obvious things, and trying to look at it from, what can we do that we're not doing. One thing is we focus on prosecution cost, and we've been asking, I wrote it down, so we've done a survey, and we've asked a large number of IP owners what would have done if they had data showing that they pay over market prices on prosecution costs. And we've asked them what would have they done with that information, and 55% said that they would have renegotiated with existing suppliers. 18% said that they would change suppliers, and 27% said that they will do nothing. And that's completely consistent with what we've been hearing. I think it's probably more than 55%. It's actually the vast majority of IP owners are happy with the relationships that they have with their existing suppliers. Obviously, it's a fairly complex relationship. It's a relationship with a supplier that has a relationship with other suppliers in place. So we could equally ask the same question, private attorneys in private practice, how do you feel about your foreign associates? And carry on from there. But what we know is that once people have comparative data, they actually want to act on it. And the way they want to act on it is by using that data to revisit what they've been doing up until now. But do people actually have that data? They don't. So we can have the panel discussion on return on investment, and the return bit is really complex and really hard. The investment bit is actually quite easy. I mean, it's not that difficult to check whether your investment is in line with market prices. Nobody's doing it.
Well, I get that's quite a nice segue into the next section of the discussion. Well, actually, what do we consider as, if we can't even work out what the returns are, can we actually work out what we're investing? And I think your conversation there is talking about the costs of patent prosecution, but actually, is that everything that is in the investment equation? What else are we investing in?
Well, there's all sorts of things to invest. You're absolutely right. I mean, a key thing, a major cost is because I'm, as I say, an engineer. I'm not a patent attorney. So we're using external patent counsel for drafting and filing all of our patents. And we have a firm in the UK that we use, and there's a firm in California we use, and a firm in Washington, DC that we're using primarily. And then obviously they have their foreign associates. And that's a huge amount of my budget, and I need to be sure that they're doing a good job. And I have had situations where they're not doing a good job, and I've got rid of the firm and taken another one on. And I think it's really important, especially when you're inexperienced, a small, medium-sized enterprise, and you're not knowing what to expect. There are lots of fantastic patent attorney firms out there, but there's also some that don't give you good advice. It's very key to have we've heard this morning about your IP strategy and understanding where you're going to file, where your markets are. And you need good advice, because sometimes patent attorneys who are perhaps less scrupulous, it's in their interest for you to spend money with them and file all over the place. So you really need to be having really excellent advice. It's one of the best investments you can have, is to work with really good firms. And they're not necessarily the most expensive firms, doesn't equate with good quality, but you need quality advice. Then you've got renewal fees, which are a huge amount of cost. You've got tools to buy. I'm paying subscriptions for various patent database management tools, for search tools. I hasten to add, I'm a one-person department. My title is currently director, but it could equally be docketer, or I do everything. I had to make a presentation to the board last week, and then I'm keeping my patent database management up to date. I have to do all of that. So I am the IP department, but that's an investment as well, and perhaps an investment that some small companies don't want to make, to actually employ somebody whose only job is to look at IP. And I don't want to big myself up, but I try and do the best job I can and make sure that that's a wide IP view, so not just patents and trademarks and copyright, but also getting involved with the open source policy of the company, and even the legal contracts that we have, trying to understand how we're licensing our IP, not necessarily licensing patents, although that is part of it, but IP in the broadest sense. So try and have a more holistic view of how IP is used in the organisation. So I'm a big investment, I suppose. My wages and time's another big investment. I need my inventors to be giving me the best time that they can so we can get best quality patents. I need to spend time educating people, doing lunch and learn sessions to try and teach them about IP. I have to try and get time from the board to get their buy-in to what we're doing. So there's all sorts of time and money, and it is an investment, and the whole company needs to be bought into it.
I think it's really clear that the investment in Anne is clearly paying a very good return. Well, what other thing, I mean, from the rest of the panel, what other things do we see in that investment equation? Because no one's really mentioned the R&D investment yet, which I'd imagine is a lot more than the patent cost.
Yeah, it's largely people and time. I mean, anybody who's been involved in R&D at all will know it's not a straight line path between A and B. The path does this, zigzag, dead ends, U-turns, you name it. But when you get to B, if you get to B, and not all projects do, of course, if you look back over your journey you've been on, okay, you're holding this thing now, and a lot of attention then, if you're that way minded, to protect this, because you've invested an awful lot, time, money, distraction, everything else around this, heaping advice and all that expensive stuff. But if you look back over your journey, you'll find there are other ways of doing the same thing strewn by the roadside. The plan Bs, the plan Cs, the other ways that weren't quite as sweet as this. And there's an awful lot of investment there, which if you don't scoop up and protect in some way, whether it's trade secret or whatever, is free pickings for others to take up. And if you've protected that and that's no longer available, what are they going to go for? All this stuff. I've got some anecdotal horror stories around that, which all sounded and made sense at the time. So discovered this sweet spot of technology, which on the face of it, stripped a whole load of cost out of the industry. And so that was patented to the nth degree. And not only that, but all this sort of ring-fence stuff, all these other ways of doing the same thing. And that was a massive portfolio of patents, not just the best way of doing it, but the sort of second and third best ways of doing it, which created this huge mean-free path of closest approach, if you like, of the sweet spots. The closest a competitor could come is there before they start stepping onto landmines. That all sounded perfect, and a lot of investment went into that. But that portfolio of patents then sat on the shelf for 10 years, not earning a dime, mainly because the industry actually took a left turn rather than a right, as far as this technology was concerned. And it was a huge cost, huge amount of investment. And this is a salutary story and lesson for those in positions of managing IP portfolios. Thankfully, I don't do that anymore. But the decision was made, and it was a sensible decision, or a meeting to have every month, reviewing portfolios. This one's come up again. It's costing an absolute fortune, not earning a dime. Why don't we just trim it back? This is the bit actually that counts. That's the bit that's going to make any money, if ever. This is all just fluff and frivolous expenditure. We don't need it. So all this ring-fence stuff was let to lapse. All, of course, published long since. And then within a year, two, if I'm being generous, there was actually what it was the price of aluminum on the LME went like that. And suddenly the industry was scrabbling around for another means of saving cost. And this was the perfect solution.
Open source solution now.
Yeah, largely. So, okay, you can't do this, but hey, you can do it these multivarious different ways. And what basically they opened up was just a competition had a field day. Picking apples from low branches wasn't it. Which, although the core technology was protected and was actually became a blockbuster, so from zero for 10 years, became a blockbuster technology in terms of license revenues and sales that more than paid for the rest of the portfolio. However, the litigation that followed, because now the mean free path wasn't that, but that. And of course, that's an extremely fuzzy boundary. And the competition were pushing at that all the time. Mm. So, yeah, looking back over the R&D path and not ignoring the second or third options is, where you've invested your time, is an exercise worth doing. Not to say you go and patent all that stuff, but to protect the sanctity of the space you've been in, even if you've just got the snow-capped peak you've protected. There are other ways of doing this, and if the market is forced to find other ways, it will. It will. So, yeah, lessons.
I think that's an interesting observation in terms of the linkage of investment. So, and again, we're talking a lot about patents here, but if you're investing in R&D, you don't always know what bits of R&D to protect or how best to protect them, and some things you'll keep trade secrets, some things you'll protect with patents. But you actually don't know which patents will stick. You don't know which ones will be granted. You don't know which ones that are granted will be valid, really. And then you don't know which ones will become the blockbusters that everyone in the industry infringes and is using.
That's right.
So there's a real spread bet issue on that.
And that changes with time.
Yeah.
The market actually decides which of these portfolio patents, if any, are going to be worth anything at all. Fingers crossed one of them is.
So
you can probably know more than you do. I think it's one of the problems of our industry is that we know so little, so we speculate, and in a way it's very good for the industry because you get I think both private practice and in-house gets to say to management, do everything, and then management says no to this, and then it's their fault. In a sense, it's good. It makes it easier. But the fact that we, as an industry, we haven't come up with any sophisticated way to know more about what could stick or not. And I mean, we've been thinking about this quite a lot, and we have ideas. So we think that citation analysis could be a way, for example, of looking at certain trends and which kind of fields are interesting and are working. And who's using citation analysis? Almost no one, right? Companies don't really track whether their patents are being cited or not. But why aren't they? I think it's an important question. You have some assets. I mean, if the assets are being mentioned, it ought to be relevant. But is anyone tracking? There are products that do that. Is anyone actually doing it? And that's what I mean. There's some things we will never know. Some things we can probably know more about. And the things we can know more about, we should. And this is in this incredibly sophisticated industry. This is how it gets better, and with figuring out this particular portfolio, I don't know if nobody knows whether the price of aluminum is going to go up. But there are models trying to predict what's going to go up. And the same models should arguably be applied to our industry in the same way that they're applied to others. But we don't even think about it. I mean, it's not that we try and apply existing models and we say it has problems, it's not perfect. We just don't. We just completely ignore the fact that there's data. And we say, well, just file a patent for everything and let management decide without any facts or data or anything.
So, Claire, back on that point that there are models and you can measure everything. Is that your experience?
I think that
all the data's there.
You can try and measure certain things. I don't know that I would agree in the sense that no one is doing it. I think there are people who are trying to do it, and there are companies who are trying to do it. And I think I agree with both of you that it's not always easy, and the market will decide, and there will be things that change. But I think that you can also try to consider what those changes might be. Where are the key risks? What points might change that would have such a big impact? And can you predict that perfectly? Of course not. Or we would have different futures ahead of all of us.
Or we'd be a lot richer.
Yeah, but I think that there is some data, and I think that there are people who are using it, and it is helping them make more efficient decisions. Could more companies benefit from that? I completely agree that we should use the information that we do have. but I think we're trying.
I think big data, all of these fantastic tools you can get out now that do all sorts of very clever metrics and modelling and so on is definitely helpful, and I do use them. I think the other thing that's important is the benefit of experience, and this is where making sure that, like I said before, the whole company is bought into it. So the benefits of having not just me in isolation making all the decisions about which patents we keep and which ones we don't, but making sure I've got the input from the commercial side and also the input from the technical side. We don't want to just abandon patents just on the strength of the technology. We also need to understand what the context of that is in the industry, and not just for where we are. You know, we make fingerprint sensors, but we make fingerprint sensors that go into bank cards. So we're working with card integrators who work with banks, who work with MasterCard. So, you know, there's a whole chain, and potentially our patents are valuable. You know, we write claims that are broad enough to rub against that whole chain. So we have to think the whole picture, not just we are a fingerprint sensor company and we will always be a fingerprint sensor company. Of course we won't. So it's data for sure, making the best of the metrics you've got, but also making the most of the people you have in your organisation and getting their opinions on what you should and shouldn't do.
I absolutely agree with you, but I also think that this is the biggest risk. the experience of the people and the fact that companies operate in a certain way is probably the most prominent blocker of change that there is in organizations. I mean, if I need to cite one reason that companies don't use data or just generally act rationally, we're doing things this way. Why are we doing things this way? We've always done it this way. And because we know that this is fine. That's how you fall into the trap of following biases. So
I'm going to gang up on Anna as well and just add a comment to that. So we work with lots of different companies of all sorts of sizes, and IP is complex and difficult. So it is left to someone that's got a depth of expertise that can advise or coach, or actually from a board perspective, just be left to get on with it, because it's something that they don't necessarily want to own or engage with. And actually, directors of companies are legally responsible for all assets, and intangible assets of a business are often, you know, a significant portion of the value of the company, but they actually don't engage with IP because it's complicated. And we're finding with more and more companies, if you talk to them about their intangible assets, they can't tell you what they are, where they are, or who they're managed. There might be someone like Anne, and I think IDEX is probably, and again, being a smaller business, it's actually easier to get around that, in that there's someone that's a subject matter expert that's got it under control and is the go-to person that can answer all those questions. But how many of those companies have actually got a dashboard that's reporting internally their intangible assets? They might have a trademark department over there reporting into marketing. They might have a patent department reporting into the general counsel. They might have those contracts with suppliers that procurement manage. And they're all intangible assets that are spread throughout different processes and systems in the business. And there is no board representative that's got the intangibles. The CFO doesn't really think about it in those ways. I think legislation with BEPS and other things will change all of that, but at the moment it's not even reported consistently, it's not measured consistently. So how do you get to measure the return on something when you don't even know what you've got within your company? I know I'm meant to be chairing this, but there we go. So I guess a sort of follow on, we're talking about return from IP or intangibles. Well, we've talked this morning about lots of different types of IP, and I just wonder if we've got, from the panel's experience, any examples of those different types of IP and how they can help generate returns or build value. Now, if Matthias was here, he gives us apologies from Dolby. He would be talking about their technology and their patents and how that generates a significant income stream from, I guess, licensing of that technology. But have we got any? I'd like some brand examples. I don't know if you've got some of that.
Yeah, I can think of some brand examples, yes. So one question that gets at this, what is a return and how should you measure return, and what is the correct answer? And I think this also touches on what Anne mentioned, which getting buy-in from different people in the organization is so important, and what is important can differ significantly. So we worked with a client recently who was looking to sell a subset of their trademarks that were distinctive in their market. They had been using this brand identity for 10, 15 years, and another company who was not currently a competitor in their country but elsewhere in the same region wanted to buy this. The chief marketing officer thought, well, this is great. I want to rebrand anyway. So, whatever they will give us would be fantastic. The CFO said, no, we need at least X million to think about this at all. And a question that added some tension to this was that if they did not transact, then there might be a lawsuit. And there may be a question of invalidity and infringement, and this was a several-step a game, and how this would end up was anyone's guess, basically. And so there was this big question in the company of how do we think about this? If we want to change our direction anyway, then getting a euro would be more than what we would do if we just changed the brand as is and spent the cost. But if we don't transact, if we ask for too much and we can't make a deal, then we'll potentially be on the hook for some other X plus X millions. And are we willing to take that risk? And they made their decision, but I'm sure it's not the same decision that every other company would make. So they had very different ways, I think, of thinking about what is this worth to us? What do we want to do? How does it fit with our longer term objective as a company? And there's not one single answer, I think. So
there's a distinction there you've made as well between a transaction, which is a sort of point-in-time event, and maybe an ongoing business that's doing R&D and creating products. And you might measure return on investment quite differently when you're looking to exit or realise or dispose of an asset, do you think?
Well, I think you're still, in terms of what is the fair price, if you would otherwise continue to use this asset, this brand, in this case, you'd be looking at, well, what would we do with it going forward? How long would it be useful otherwise? Which could be quite some time with the brand. But if you were otherwise going to shelve it, and you wouldn't be using it at all, then you're also putting yourself in the perspective of the other party of, well, what would they be doing with it? What will it add to them, right? So you have to put yourself in sort of both of these positions of what would we do, what would the counterparty do, and where can we find some potential middle ground to agree on a transaction price. Yeah. So I don't think that you necessarily ignore it. I think that it's just two sides, and this is where you sometimes get to a range of values.
Well, I think, again, back to the ROI calculation, it's so context sensitive, isn't it? Because
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe it's time if there's any questions from the audience to contribute. We can always rely on Chris. Do you need a microphone, Chris?
No, I don't. I need 2 questions, actually.
Do you need LinkedIn?
Well, one at a time, just in case.
The amplification problem.
So the general question, first one is, I would work with a lot of SMEs, and SME means it's a big range. So I've got clients with £1 million turnover, clients with £100 million turnover, and they're still SMEs. Right? So my question, and I have my own answer, but I'm interested in your answer, is do you think IP is more important to an SME than it is to a multinational? And you ideally would answer that question.
I'll go last.
in words of one syllable, yes.
Why?
Yes. SMEs generally are built around one idea, and that's the idea they're striving to develop and take to market. Whereas multinationals they've evolved over the years and followed their noses with, I can only speak from my own experience of building a huge portfolio of IP. Like I said, 95+% of it wasn't earning a dime. They were just, in a way, just playing casino on the technology table. One of these will become good, fingers crossed. And our market and our business is big enough that if it does, it'll more than pay for the rest. And that question as to where that sweet spot was moved with time. An SME doesn't have that. They've got one pony and that's it. But let's hope it's got 4 legs and can run. But therein is the opportunity. You don't need a huge portfolio. That's it. Let's take this. It's going to move left and right, but this is the horse we're backing. and the ways of protecting that are almost by definition limited. So we haven't got to sell the family silver too many times to cover this, and ultimately the market decides. So yes.
1 yes and 3 silence.
It depends on the space. If it's an IP focused space, I completely agree. If it's a non-IP focused space, internet software, then no. The SMEs need to focus on the most important things in their industry. So if the most important thing in their industry is IP, then they need to focus on IP. If it's a biotech company, it needs to focus on IP. If it's an internet software company, it needs to focus on traction. And so SME needs to get the most important thing right first, and then get all the rest of the things in place.
I'd say if you mean IP in the broadest sense, then
Yes, I do.
all the technology companies I've ever worked for, that's all there is. It's IP. That's what you do every day. You don't necessarily patent it all, but you're just making IP. So it's equal for small and big companies. If you specifically mean patents, you know, I've got 2 things I can think about. When I was working in CSR, when we had thousands of patents, you know, some of them were important, some of them less so. Now, when I'm working in IDEX with a very restricted budget, a small company, every single one of my patents matters, and I know exactly why. Every single one matters to me. So, yeah, it doesn't really answer your question.
Yes.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think that I've seen both. In terms of there are small and mid-sized companies where having a single patent can be everything. But you know, I can also think of huge multinationals where their IP is also their business, and like you said, it can include both patents, portfolios. It can include the customer lists and the trade secrets in terms of processes. And so I think that any company that wants to make IP the key piece, you can do it. It is broad enough, and I think sometimes we limit it to, you know, trademarks, copyrights, patents, and we see it as more than that. So I think it is important for everyone, and maybe I'm biased, right, given that I sit here and value IP all day.
What else could you do if there was no IP,
Exactly. Right? It's so important.
It's really, really important.
That was a great answer, thank you. My second question, just on the last point you discussed, is to do with hurdle rates. So I did some work with a publishing company a while back, and they were trying to figure out, they had 6,000 products, and they're an SME, so not one pony. The portfolio management was all about where do you invest. And the client had read brick by brick the Lego story and their 13% hurdle rate for ROI on IP, and decided they were going to implement that within the company that makes children's books. So there's an interesting comparison. But actually it worked extremely well. And I just wondered, you're talking about ROI at the beginning and how do you measure success. Have you guys thought about the use of, you know, internal hurdle rates for IP and the business modelling that goes along with that? I have to make a 13% ROI or I'm not doing it. I'm pulling the plug.
I don't think I've seen any of our, well, in fact, only one client that's thought about that kind of direct measurement when they're making those investments, but not many.
No, I don't think so. I've seen people look at the amount of R&D spend and compare that, numbers of patents, or look at R&D spend and compare that among other industry, but not in the specific sense you're talking about.
And at one level, it's sort of abdicating responsibility of making a gut feel decision, isn't it? It's relying on the spreadsheet to make the decision for you.
I think Zeev would call that data.
Yeah. The only sector I can think about where I think something like that would at some point need to work is the tech transfer sector. I mean, the tech transfer sector is failing to deliver outcome in all geographies. consistently, even the best universities. And at some point it needs to figure out how to do tech transfer properly. And finding how to measure, so it's not easy to measure it at all. But finding for a company in a particular space or a particular sector, it's probably impossible. For a tech transfer that takes most of its revenue from licensing, so actually can measure outcome in a reasonably predictable way, I would like to see that something more tangible in tech transfer.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the tech transfer side of things is actually very measurable because you know what research investments going in each university, that those statistics are available. You know how many patents are being filed, and you know, or they know how many license deals and spin-outs are created and what equity they own in those spin-outs and how many events.
And they do measure it in over years. Yeah.
It's very poor. The return is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I don't. Anyone's disagreeing with the point that it could be improved.
Can I just make? I want to make a couple of observations on the return on investment, especially in the SME sector. I'm a patent attorney and I've worked for big companies and for small companies. I currently work for a lot of SMEs. The number one return on investment for, say, patenting is a 20-year monopoly right to make a product with a margin. That's it. It's not about anything else for most of these companies. It's about securing a monopoly right and control. And that's
I'd disagree with that for every single startup Clearview's ever worked with.
Oh, well, not everyone. Most of the thing about R&D as well is it's a sunk cost, and most R&D fails. And then what's left after the R&D quite often is a bit of the IP.
Yeah, but the value of that IP, though, comes a lot later. So if you look at the value of patents to startups, it's their fundraising, and they can claim they will have a monopoly right one day on this differentiated technology.
Yeah.
So,
well, the only reason why they get investors is because the investors believe they're going to have a monopoly, make a lot of money. That's what it's about.
Agreed. But the reality is I don't think they ever ended up with that monopoly.
Oh, most of them don't. Most of them don't. And it's the R&D fails. The market failure is a big one. But it's never the IP that sinks them, the costs. Very rarely. They fall for other reasons. The other point I'd like to make is that on the cost side, one of the biggest costs I see is not the spend in terms of patent fees or renewals or anything like that. It's the amount of time and effort that the management team within the SME have to put into the management part of their IP portfolio. So a lot of companies underestimate the amount of time and effort that's required both in follow-on R&D to support patent filings, new data, etc., to keep things going, in prosecution, for example. But someone has to be looking after those assets. And that takes time and effort and money. And my third point is, the problem there is not many people have those skills within these companies. Very, very few. And that's where a lot of the money's wasted, in my experience.
Oh, 10 minutes. Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Any more observations or comments and contributions? Okay, well, let's move on then. So I guess we're sort of thinking about the last point being, well, given all of this, what's really the correct way to manage your IP portfolio? Any comments to add on that?
I've got a big long list.
Okay.
Right.
And you're up. We'll see what we can add.
What is the correct way to manage it? I think I've never worked in an environment where it's not all about achieve more and spend less. You know, you're a victim of your own success if you do this well. You have more patents, but every year you ask for the next year's, you put in your budget request, and they come back and say, yeah, but can you just spend the same as you did last year or even less? But you have yet to, make the patent portfolio grow more. So that's what it's all about, really. It's about keeping that investment down, to Zev's point, but increasing the efficiencies, but trying to maintain quality. And that's all about tools. It's about communication. It's about having a clear strategy, making sure you're aware of what the business is trying to achieve, who its customers are, what what we even, what's the selling price? You're the IP department, but you should know what's the product, what do we sell it for? Who are our main competitors? Who are our partners? Who are our suppliers? Who are their customers? And trying to be, fully aware of the market so that you can make the best decisions that you can. I still think you also, you disagreed with one point earlier, but I do think you need to try and work with the people that you've got in your organisation and use the best information you've got from them. So you're trying to not be biased in your decisions, but and not be political about deciding what you keep and what you don't keep. You've got to have good advice, and you do have to, your point earlier, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away. You have to also prune and keep your costs down by examining what you've got, and if patents are not worth you keeping, get rid of them or sell them, and use that money to reinvest and get patents that you do need.
Sorry, I thought it was going to be a longer list.
I've got a long list. I'll stop.
We should help. Yeah, anyone else got? Andrew, any views?
Yeah, I would echo the alignment is the big challenge that we see, because you can do something within the IP group, and then if that ends up being counter to what your CFO wants to do, what the business development team is doing, you end up in a deadlock. So I think getting on the same page at the outset is critical to being efficient in terms of managing your IP.
Yeah, I think efficiency of the investment from within the company on its IP is key, and of course there are many stakeholders within the business. You've obviously got the business side of the organisation, who should have visibility on where the markets are, where the opportunities are developing. But there's also the tech guys, the inventors who came up with this stuff in the first place. What are they now working on? Is what you're sitting there looking at actually yesterday's technology, and it's fast moving? Because if you're in that space, then patents are a total waste of time. And if you've got them, you may as well get rid of them. But the holistic view across the business, but certainly floating these questions up to the C-suite to get their engagement, but having the language that they understand, that then looks quite hard at the portfolio to decide which do we keep, which do we not, is absolutely key. You can't do that in isolation.
But you think you'd involve that C-suite in making
ultimately,
those
yeah. I mean, if it's a real hard decision in terms of here's that expensive portfolio, we've kept it for this time, it's done nothing, we're going to let it go. Do you agree? You have to have that business engagement. Yeah. If for no better reason, if it's the wrong decision.
So I haven't disagreed before that you need to talk to everyone. On the contrary, I was just warning from getting into a cliche mode. We do this because we've always done that, and these sort of things. I think that there are quite a few SMEs here with no IP manager, and I think that they're in an inherent position of an extreme inferiority. And the worst thing that can possibly happen is let IP go to autopilot. And this is what happens in the vast majority of companies. So almost any company that doesn't have a full-time IP manager the IP goes to autopilot. The CEO/CTO/CFO just don't care. One of the cliches is we've taken a big brand patent firm or trademark firm to manage it for us, and we trust them to do it properly, which even if they are fantastic, they won't do properly because it's not their assets. They don't understand the business behind it. So the data is one element, but it's also being annoying, asking the questions. Why? This is what we want to achieve. Why are we doing this? And the more you dig in, and I think this kind of touches on Nick's point. So if you spend that time, then you win on the return side. If you don't spend that time, then you lose on the return side. So you have to spend the time. And if there's no IP manager, it's the executives that have to do it. And if there is an IP manager, then sometimes the executives only when it's super important. So. And
it can be creative as well. Having an IP manager is not just about paying my wage, but if it's done right, by asking these difficult, annoying questions, I quite agree, I can be quite annoying, by asking, well, why are we doing this and why are we doing that? You can actually create new inventions, even just by that process, where you're asking people, why are we doing it this way, and why are we not doing it that way? And for the first time ever in 12 years of working in patents, I'm now an inventor. My name's on a draft. It's not granted yet, it's pending.
I'm sure it will be.
It's the biggest thrill of my life to be an inventor. After all these years of shuffling patents around, I'm named as an inventor, and that only happened because I was asking questions, and instead of asking the question, I had an answer, a suggested answer, and we've decided to patent that.
So next year,
you can create stuff.
Next year, I hope to congratulate you for a granted patent. On IP managers, and I think it's true for executives as well. When I was in private practice, I worked with two types of IP managers: the IP managers that outsource and let go, and the IP managers that actually care. The first one would never work in a tech company that I will run. And the second one is the really good type. Mm-hmm. So being annoying and asking the question is doing your job properly.
I also matchmake. That's the other thing. You can, if you start to know the company well enough, you can say, oh, well, this guy's working over this on this technology, and this guy over here is working on this technology, and maybe you could work together. And that's occasionally, not all the time, but sometimes has created an invention in itself, because you can see how some things could come together.
My experience of playing that role in a big organisation was actually the external patent attorney firm that you're engaging with. They welcome you with open arms. You are the perfect person to engage with, because it's your job to do this, to interface with the inventors, to pass, almost translate the questions of the patent attorney into the engineer's language, and reverse. So the answer comes back, and then you can converse with the patent attorney. Got it. So it can make that process efficient.
Thank you, Andrew. I've been given a pretty clear signal from the front. So there's one gentleman in the far corner who's been putting his arm, you must be getting very tired now having that arm in the air for so long. Can we just do one last quick question and then we'll terminate?
Thank you. It was a question about ROI per territory. If you've got a portfolio, you will probably file in US, Europe, China, Japan maybe. Outside of the obvious ones, what's your experience of getting good ROI from other territories? Or maybe a rationale for doing so, or should we just narrow down to 3 or 4?
We tended to go by where are the markets, where have we got plants, where are competitors, trade routes, or even sometimes strategic partners. So where we didn't have a presence, but we wanted to have a commercial presence, and we'd identify a local manufacturer who we then would license to take on the technology.
Okay, so you're up to 30 territories for me, but I'm not going to do that. So what's the real ROI of me having a patent in Kenya where I'm selling product, but
none at all.
It's not a big market. So
USA, Germany, China, then we talk about the rest.
Okay.
Sorry.
So
and the rest of the panel, I think we're
planning a product.
Yeah, there's a bit of it. It depends.
And it's kind of a wisdom of the crowd. Let's look at where the competitors are fighting and see where they are. But it doesn't mean that the competitors are doing it right. It's just interesting.
Depending on the size of the opportunity, you'd pare back on that long list of territories. We used to have 3 scales, sort of high, medium, low. It's a crystal ball gazing exercise at best. You know, it's just unfortunate you've got to make that call right at the start. You know, and who knows? The definition of technology almost means it's ahead of time. It's ahead of its own time. You just fingers crossed. There's going to be a market for this thing. You just don't know how big it's going to be.
And this goes back to my point about having good advice from good patent attorneys. It's not the right advice to validate in every European state, patent all over the world, unless you're in certain industries. And the industry I'm in, that's not the right advice. It's America, China, Germany, Holland, Japan, Korea, maybe Taiwan if you're using some manufacturing methods. So yeah, it's about having to be brave. You do have to make a decision. You have to make it up front, but it's not everywhere.
So I've got to be brave as well now because I'm getting even clearer signals. So thank you to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Again, I think it all comes back to strategy. and knowing what you want and making that decision, and maybe sometimes making that tough decision. And also we need to be annoying and ask lots and lots of questions. Thank you. We now have a standalone presentation, The Future of Influence on Social Media, by Alex Watt, partner at Brown Jacobson LLP. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Hi, my name is Alex Watt. I'm a partner at Brown Jacobson, and I'm going to talk to you today about a subject I know you're all familiar, because standing at the back of the room there, I could see that social media was playing a very heavy part in your interest in the last presentation. It is actually, if we're here at Tech, it's one of the most important areas, because it's effectively how much more integrated we all are. And what's interesting about social media particularly is the way it's being leveraged. Because it's being leveraged from the bottom up. Suddenly, brands are turning to individuals, influencers, in order to sell their goods, which is a very exciting thing to happen, I think. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. I'll be giving you a few insights about what I think is going to happen with influence on social media. But more to the point, because I'm a partner in a law firm, I'm going to tell you how I think you ought to be negotiating these agreements over the course of the next few years, because thus far we've seen a fairly lackadaisical approach to them. One of the things I'll give you straight off the bat is the fact that I think we're going to start seeing retail being eaten by influence on social media. So what we're already starting to see, because of the power of the internet and because competition law is not, as Philip Hammond said, suitable for application to both online and in-store, this race to the bottom, and retail stores on the high street are not faring very well. At the same time, you have influencers that are selling things to their audiences immediately, and I think we're going to start seeing sales move from retail into influence. So for all of you that are involved, even loosely, well, in any business, where you're selling goods, certainly, you should be thinking very carefully about how you engage online and how you use influencers. For those of you that have been asleep for the last 10 years or underneath a rock or something or other, an influencer is someone... Are there any influencers in the audience today, by the way? No, good, I'm safe. Excellent. An influencer is someone that has influence online. That is to say, generally someone that has a large following, perhaps on Instagram, perhaps on Facebook, or any one of their social media sites. The point being that people are invested in them, they follow them, and their concerns are their audience's concerns. And so brands are turning to these influencers in order to sell stuff. And you can have many different types of influencers. You have everything from Angelina Jolie with many, many hundreds of millions of followers, all the way down to YouTubers who may be 16, 17 years old that have literally just been sat in front of a computer their entire life and not done very much else. So there's a vast range of types of agreements and people that you'll be involved with. One of the things that we have seen, though, is some fairly shonky agreements along the way. And with every boom, there's always people saying that there's going to be a bust. And so the question is, are these sorts of headlines... Is this working? You might have to flick it on from the computer. Are these sorts of headlines, the ones that will come up imminently, the sorts of headlines that are true? Is it a bubble? Is it about to burst? What we found actually is we don't think it is. We think that this is just the direction of travel, the consequence of which is that if it's not a bubble that's about to burst, what is about to happen? Well, it's about to mature. It's a market that is maturing. And so what we're seeing is, instead of the smaller agreements, one pages, it's just an influencer, don't worry. What we're seeing is, we're seeing agencies emerge, and smaller agencies and then larger agencies being bought by even bigger agencies. And eventually, companies like Disney are starting their own agencies. So I'm going to skim very quickly through the sorts of things that you need to consider when you're doing a deal with one of these agencies. So the first thing is to remember that ultimately this is a services agreement. It's a simple agreement. It shouldn't be complicated, and you need to make sure that within that agreement you cover off things like quality of images and text, quantity of posts. One of the things I've seen a lot that happens with influencers, particularly if you're not dealing with a reputable agency, is you start off with a campaign that you've got going and 12 posts, and by the time you've negotiated the agreement, it's down to 4 posts, and it's a moving feast. So you need to stick very carefully to your guns. Make sure that the payments are strategic in the way that you would with any other deal. Make sure that if you can make them on milestones or after there's been a particular period of activity. If you can, make sure that all the posts are approved so that you can, if it's got your brand in, you want to make sure that your brand maintains brand guidelines. Sometimes they'll tell you that they can't do it because they do it live, and that's very difficult. But in fact, if they give you that, you can pre-record things like stories on Instagram and issue them later. Make sure you have a clear brief and deliverables, and check that what you've got it linked to, that you're trying to, the interest that you're trying to drive, the influence that you want, is tied in. So make sure that they've got within the post, you know, the promotion link. Is it a giveaway? Make sure you've got the promo code. If you've got a competition, make sure it's got the terms. And do your research. Before you take on an influencer, what you do need to be careful is that you choose them carefully. I don't know if any of you know Logan Paul here. No? So he was someone that had very many millions of followers and many millions of dollars in revenue. He then filmed himself going into a forest where people tended to commit suicide in Japan, given his audience were largely kids, and all of the brands dropped him. And he doesn't have any influence now at all. But you've got to make sure that you're not doing a deal with him, and that instead you're doing it with someone that you can do a deal with. Do you want them to be exclusive? What have they done in the past? One of the things you don't want to do is, we did a deal with someone that had done a huge deal in the past that was very similar to the deal that we were doing, and it meant that they could reuse all their own images and look like they were piggybacking on your campaign. So yeah, and it's your job to do this due diligence, which means you might have to watch some of those awful, awful videos. Don't breach the cap code. I'm not going to turn this into one of those old social media talks we all used to have where they talked about what you need to do according to the cap code. But do make sure if they've got a young audience that it's suitable for your brand. So if you're selling booze, don't use that influencer. In short, the whole thing about ad and spawn, you may have been to talks, they talked about that endlessly. It's basically just ad. Unless you're giving away stuff and not really telling them how to do it, when you can use spawn, it's ad. What we are seeing is paid promotions being used more. So you don't even put the hashtag. It's just one of those things that pops up above the photo. A good example of how the ASA are flexible, though, is this old ruling. The ASA ruling Mars Chocolate and UK Limited, where they had a variety of different influencers. One of them was a young lady called Katie Price, who tweeted, "Great news about China's latest GDP figures." And that was followed up with, "Chinese leaders are now likely to loosen monetary policy to stimulate growth. Yay." And OMG, Eurozone debt problems can only be properly solved by true fiscal union. Hashtag, come on, guys. And it was all followed by, "You're not you when you're hungry," at Snickers UK, hungry, spawn. Which is quite clever, but of course people complained about it, I'm sure for a variety of reasons, because none of the other tweets had the sort of appropriate hashtags. But what the ASA ruled was that it was fine. It was clearly part of a series of tweets, and as such, it should be allowed. So there is some flexibility. This is IP week, so I'm not going to dwell on this too heavily, but essentially, make sure your influencers are taking the image that they're using, otherwise you're going to get yourself into serious trouble. Make sure you've got an indemnity, though do bear in mind that if they're a man of straw, they don't have huge means, then worry about what the worth of that will be. Make sure you get the rights that you want to use. Make sure that you have, if you want to use it yourself, that you own it. If it's licensed, then it's an extension to this deal. Make sure there are no other brands in shot. For example here, that's a terrible image for lots of different reasons. Not only are there other brands in shop, but it's just a horrible-looking bathroom. Don't contract with the wrong party. One of the things that we see a lot is people thinking that you're going to do a deal with the influencer themselves, but actually what happens is, particularly if they're a celebrity, you don't end up doing the deal with them. They either have a limited liability vehicle, an SPV, that they do their business through, or you're actually doing it with the agency. And then you need to think about, where's the flow of money? So you've got the obligations possibly provided to you under your agreement with the agency with procure that terms for the influencer. Is the money being paid to the influencer? Is it being paid to the agency? It's one of those things you need to be very careful about. Don't forget that social media knows no boundaries. It's borderless. So what jurisdiction is it? And you've got to be very careful that you don't inadvertently end up within the ambit of another different jurisdiction's advertising regulations. So you've got to think about your active and passive advertising. Are you actively promoting it to the UK? Are you inadvertently promoting it somewhere else? Could you be accused of running a competition in Germany and not abiding by the German social media rules? What impact does that have on exclusivity? You know, do you have exclusivity in the UK but not other countries? And think about the platform. Each of these different platforms have different terms and conditions, different obligations. Facebook and Instagrams, for example, are very different from Twitter's. So you're in a position whereby you have chosen your influencer very carefully. You've made sure that everything that you want from them you've got, that they're a foppish Englishman and a leading light in the 1990s, and what could possibly go wrong, right? And then this happens. You're in a situation whereby you've got a celebrity that's ended up in an awkward situation that's bringing your brand into disrepute. You need to make sure that you have clauses in the agreement, reputation clauses, morality clauses they can be called, whereby you can just terminate the agreement. Then and there, generally is what you want is it to be as discretionary as possible. You need to also remember when you're dealing with influencers on social media that you need to be able to demand that they take their posts down. In fact, one of the things that we have seen is an obligation for the influencer to provide you with their username and password so that in these circumstances you can go in and take the post down yourself. Now, if you think that this all sounds very obvious, I can tell you that Chris Webber, who was a basketball player, a few years ago got dropped by Fila for being caught smoking marijuana. And he was very upset by that. And he sued them. He's saying, you know, you can't do this. And they said, well, you know, you're bringing our brand into disrepute. And of course, they hadn't got a morality clause in their agreement. And he successfully sued them for $2.4 million. So don't take it lightly. And I think I'm about to run out of time. I think I am. So what I would say is that I think what you're going to see in the future is a maturing of the market. You're going to see more and more of this happening. I think what you're going to see that is perhaps unexpected is this move, this big move from sales in the real world to sales by means of influencers. You'll see more and more on social media those little white spots pop up on the images where if you click them, it'll take them through to a site. And there'll be some other interesting points to discuss and consider when that really takes hold more. You know, are those influencers acting as agents, for example? Do the commercial agents regulations apply to them? But yes, I hope of interest to you. That's the end of my talk. If you would like to discuss any point with me, then I'll be outside. Do feel free to get in touch and link in with me. Thank you.
Thank you for taking us through the social media and what we need to think about when we are doing agreements in that space. We're going to have a coffee, tea, and networking break again. So if you all want to come back at 4:45, then we'll continue with our last panel discussion of the day. Thank you.